Valley, Rock County, Marshall.
Yeah, Marshall. I've been to half of them.
Half of them, at least. Okay, so he's been able to be teaching a lot of students around the state, many of them who would then come here to Madison because he talked about how great this campus is. So he's done a lot of work on the, he also is an archaeologist who works in upper Wisconsin. So he does archaeology of Native American materials here in Wisconsin as a part of CRM, or Cultural Resource Management. And he's been working with groups here in Wisconsin as well. His focus for his dissertation is on copper. And today he will be presenting the discussion of copper technology in the Indus Valley and Indus copper and bronze metallurgy, a model from Harappa. So Harappa is one of the earliest urban centers. He'll talk about that, and he's worked there, so he's had first-hand knowledge of this material. So please welcome Brett Hoffman.
Thank you for that great introduction, Mark, and thank all of you for coming and listening to my talk. It appears there's going to be a few slides as we go through this where the margins are cut off. So if you see me constantly looking over the screen, that's to see if there's anything critical that I need to update you with that it was supposed to be there as a visual. But we'll get through it, and all the good stuff is there. I need to thank a lot of people. Many of the people listed on the slide, and then also many people that aren't listed on the slide. For those of you that have seen a presentation given by Dr. Knoyer, or Dr. Law, or Dr. Furnez, or Dr. Jameson, some of the other folks who work at various places in South Asia on third millennium archaeology, and of course Dr. Knoyer as my mentor, you're going to recognize some of this stuff. And it's only through the gracious sharing of data and images that I was able to put the talk together that I have today. So that needs to be acknowledged, and not only that, but those individuals and many more have helped me to focus my ideas and understand what I'm looking at. And what I want to talk to you about today is I specifically eventually want to get around to copper at Harappa, copper and bronze metallurgy at the Indus site of Harappa. But before I do that, I'd like to give an overview, very brief, of what's going on in the third millennium with a variety of early states across the old world, and how they're interacting with one another, and how they're using metals based on what we know. So I'm going to give some background and some basics, and then we'll start looking at how these situations can apply in the Indus and what's different about what's going on in the Indus based on the data that I've been able to look at from the city of Harappa. The first thing is we know that the Indus civilization is contemporary with many other old world states. States in China, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and then lots of places not even on this map also have fairly complex phenomena going on. It was previously and initially believed around the time that the first Indus cities were excavated in the 1920s and 1930s, it was believed that perhaps somehow the idea of urbanism, the idea of having a big society was somehow imported to South Asia from the West. The research that's been going on by many scholars in India, Pakistan, from America, from Europe, have demonstrated that that's not the case. And we now know that it's an indigenous development that kind of overlaps and is contemporary with lots of other early states. This has some information about errors on the side that's cut off, but really the key thing is highlighted there in the box. Is primarily today I'm going to be talking about the urban phase, or right before the urban phase, what's known as the Harappan phase of the Indus civilization. So roughly the whole third millennium BC is kind of the playground for this talk. And one of the things that we know archaeologically is Indus sites of all sizes have been excavated, and we see the presence of certain diagnostic kinds of artifacts. And I've thrown a few of them up here. We have the cubical stone weights, distinctive Indus-style figurines, pointed-based goblets, steatite seals and tokens and other kinds of objects that are carved with distinctive Indus script and animal styles, much of which has been researched by Drs. Knoyer, Jameson, Furnez, and other people. We have the red on black pottery, and then the use of lots of materials to make personal ornaments. These are distinctive bits that we can dig up from third millennium sites to help us understand that we're looking at potentially an Indus site. Using this kind of approach, we can roughly sketch out a map of the third millennium phenomenon of the Indus Civilization. I've highlighted on this map some of the major settlements and sites. You can see it's an extensive area. It incorporates more geographic area than any other old world state that we're aware of. It's a very large phenomenon spread over a diverse set of ecosystems and geographic zones. The data that I'll present today primarily comes from Harappa, situated there on the floodplain. Pardon, I should say this one last thing. Take a look at this map, and one of the things that will become relevant later is that, it's only a tricky pointer. What will become relevant later is you see where Harappa is. It's situated in this green zone in a floodplain where there's various different river courses. And then you don't have any rock or mineral resources right in that immediate area until you almost get outside of the area in the yellow line. So you have to go to areas far away from the city of Harappa to get these stone and mineral resources, such as copper, that I'll be discussing later. So during the third millennium BC, across the floodplain area and across the area incorporated the Indus River and the Ghaggar as well, we see the emergence of a variety of different sizes of Indus sites. Indus sites are primarily marked by the major urban centers such as Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Rocky Gari, but we also see a settlement hierarchy or system of interconnected settlements that they're interacting with one another in political, social, and economic ways, and we see them in a variety of sizes, regional towns all the way down to hamlets. So we get this complex, integrated urban phenomenon. One of the most enigmatic aspects of this civilization is that it has writing, it has a script, the Indus script. It's not yet been deciphered. Much work has been done on this. There's lots of very interesting pieces out there that I really do believe eventually scholars will be able to put this puzzle together, but it hasn't happened yet. But it does appear from an analysis of where writing appears, what kind of objects it appears on. Right? We begin to understand that it must have been used for a lot of different things. These things can range from economic to personal identification and perhaps for ritual use as well. So unlike other civilizations, such as those that we find in Mesopotamia, those that we find in Egypt, some of the early states that we see in China, we cannot read the writing of the Indus. So we cannot hear about Harappans in their own words. In Mesopotamia, we can hear about Mesopotamians in their own words. We can understand elements of Egyptian daily life, Egyptian economic life, Egyptian religious life in their own words, in their own records, their own writing. And we're missing this in the Indus. This has kind of forced us as archaeologists to really consider other ways to attempt to answer these questions. For instance, we don't see status and wealth in the Indus the same way we do in, say, Mesopotamian cities or big Egyptian pyramids, where it's pretty clear that that is an important person because they're buried in a special monument that's very large and prominent, and they're buried with great amounts of wealth. These are typical burials from the site of Harappa. They're very simple interments, and they don't have a lot of grave goods, usually some pottery and some personal ornaments. You can see bangles on the one person's arm there and a necklace on another, and then surrounded in both cases by this black on red pottery. This is a sharp contrast with other early states from the map I showed you earlier, where it is more straightforward in the archaeological record to identify the elites and who's in charge. So as a result of this, one of the things that Indus scholars have turned to is very detailed studies of different kinds of artifacts, different raw materials, and different technologies. This approach has been pioneered by Dr. Knoyer, as well as his other colleagues. And it's this detailed study of artifacts that have really allowed us to begin to understand more about the Indus than perhaps just traditional approaches of looking for tombs, temples, and elite burials. Because again, not only in the burials, but these are examples of kind of the monumental architecture we get in Indus cities, such as the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, or some of the large city walls here with a reconstructed gateway from Harappa, the sewers and drainage system. These are all massive, publicly built architecture, but we don't know who was directing. So, returning to the idea of artifacts, my interest in the Indus started with, I wanted to understand more about the Indus economy. I wanted to understand who they were interacting with, who they were trading with, what they were trading. And many years ago, I had a conversation with Dr. Knoyer, and he said, you should look at the metals. Look at copper, there's something to be done there. And so I began to look at all of the different things that we know Indus people made out of copper. And we have an incredible diversity of objects. We have everyday objects, such as cosmetic containers and mirrors and cooking pans, to scale pans that would have used as cubical stone weights I showed earlier to weigh certain goods. Some sort of incised tablets or tokens that we don't quite know how they would have functioned, but likely had an economic or administrative purpose. Ranging from tools and weapons, such as spears and axes and arrows. Then we also know that copper and bronze items were used in the elaborate personal ornamentation that is a hallmark of some aspects of the Indus. This is an incredible jewelry hoard that was found from the site of Aladino, and we can see in this female figurine from Harappa how draped in jewelry and ornaments certain elements of the Indus population would have been. And above here we see some copper or bronze bangles. But it wasn't just things that would have been for display or to wear. We also see copper and bronze being used in everyday things. We see up here typical ceramic Indus-style cooking pots. And then I'll call your attention to these modern metal pots. And then we can examine this Indus metal or copper cooking pot. And we see a similarity in form. So it's interesting to begin to hypothesize or theorize that perhaps there's continuity within the region, continuity within South Asia from forms and trends we see in the Indus into modern times. It is possible that the mimicry in metal of what was going on in the ceramic with Indus cooking pots, perhaps that meant that elite people or richer people, the wealthier, higher status people, used metal pots. It's an idea. This is an interesting picture that was recently shared with me, and you see here that this gentleman is using an anvil for shaping copper vessels in a workshop in Oman. And we see something that looks incredibly similar from an excavated context at Dolavira. So perhaps we see a continuity within a larger South Asian region of some of the copper and bronze metalworking techniques that began all the way back in the 3rd millennium. So we can see that Indus sites such as Dolavira, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and even smaller sites are using a great amount of copper and bronze materials. And the interesting thing says, okay, where are they getting the raw materials to make these? Where are they getting the finished goods? And then are they sending copper and bronze out anywhere? Because what we know is that sites like Harappa were involved in extensive and detailed interaction networks that brought raw materials and goods from all over South Asia to the site. And then we also know sites like Harappa were engaged in interaction networks that sent Indus materials out to other regions, such as Oman, Iran, Mesopotamia. So it occurred to me to think about what are the other major copper and bronze using locations that are contemporary with the Indus. So we know that there's major Bronze Age occupations in Oman, Bahrain, Iran, Egypt, Mesopotamia, in the Indus. And so one of the things I thought was, what is metal being used for? And how is metal being approached in some of those societies where perhaps we have a slightly better understanding? For a very long time, copper and bronze has been very understudied in the Indus civilization. And you find some commonalities. This is just a collage of images, primarily from Mesopotamia and Egypt, broadly covering the 3rd millennium. And what we see is two trends. Is copper and bronze have a big use, particularly bronze, for weaponry, or items at least that could be used as weapons. We see some actual weapons here, more of a ceremonial weapon. And then we also see elites, meaning the people in charge of these societies, cloaking themselves in the iconography of warfare and conquest. This very important way to justify your leadership in Egypt or Mesopotamia. It is by no means the only one, but it is one of the ones that was used to say, I went out and I conquered these people. I am strong, right? I can protect you. I can expand the borders of our country, or whatever the concepts may have been. We also see a very different way of burying the dead. And I just want to use a couple of examples from Mesopotamia here. This is in images of the royal cemetery at Ur. And what you can see is in the shadows of this large ziggurat, which is essentially a very large temple constructed using all organization with lots of labor and resources. We see a royal cemetery. There's a reconstruction in the corner there where elites would have been buried not only with lavish grave goods, items of wealth and status and prestige, they were also buried with animals and people to accompany them into the afterlife. In other words, elites in Mesopotamia, the leadership of Mesopotamia, was viewed as so important and so much differentiated from the rest of society that they could be buried with resources. They could take wealth out of circulation, and they even took people and animals out of circulation to accompany them to the afterlife. And one of the things we see emerging from these elite burials in places like Mesopotamia is we see a lot of objects made with copper and bronze. Some whole copper and bronze objects to other objects that have copper and bronze elements. And so this contrasts very directly with what we don't see in the Indus, right? We don't see the same thing in the Indus. We don't see elite burials. We don't see large public monuments. We don't see the removal of copper and bronze materials from circulation for burials with elites. And we also don't see individual people at Indus sites, such as Harappa, using the iconography of warfare or conquest to further and advance their legitimacy at the top of some sort of social or political hierarchy. So this really big contrast in how metal was used and how society appeared to be organized had led to some traditional views on copper and bronze metallurgy across the Indus that, in my belief, have become outmoded. And it was thought that Indus copper metallurgy was less complex than Mesopotamian metallurgy. It was an incomplete development. One of the primary reasons for this is that much, at least in the early excavations up until a few decades ago, much of the metal that was excavated from a place like Mesopotamia or a place like Egypt was excavated from these elite burials. So it was the really high-end stuff. And as a result, when people analyze it, they're like, oh, wow, they use a lot of bronze. And bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. Tin is very rare and difficult to find in the old world. There's lots of discussions about tin would have been precious and expensive. So it's this idea that you advance from a Stone Age, you replace the use of stone with copper, and you replace the use of copper with tin and bronze, right? And then you're a proper Bronze Age metallurgical civilization. People analyzed some of the early stuff coming out of the Indus excavations, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, for instance, and they found out that, well, wait a second, they don't use as much tin bronze as we're seeing in Mesopotamia. And there was this idea, aha, they're less complex because they've made this incomplete transition. And this idea of transitions, right, of types of raw materials replacing one another, has been now demonstrated across the world to be a fairly outmoded and outdated idea. And we need to reject that in terms of a new model that a complex use of copper and a variety of copper alloys is actually more realistic of what a Bronze Age situation would look like. So I started thinking, we have all these questions about Indus copper and bronze metallurgy, and it appears to be different. I decided that some of the I needed to do a research project and come up with some ideas. And they were focused around these three core questions. Are there patterns of alloy use at Harappa? In other words, do we see bronze made from tin being used for a specific thing, and an alloy of copper with some other metals such as arsenic or lead being used for other things? Are they making any of this stuff at this large urban center, right? Or is it being made somewhere else and we're only seeing the consumption of finished products? And then finally, where is all this stuff coming from, right? If we're using a lot of metal at Indus sites, where are they getting the metal from? One of the first things I did is I looked at what the existing data said. And the existing data basically said that there's more bronze than we previously thought, because we need to change our interpretation of bronze. And if we understand that anything alloyed with copper is a bronze, so tin, arsenic, lead, or a combination of all of those elements, we actually see an increasing use of alloys at Indus sites. So what you see here is a stacked series of bar graphs from a variety of previously excavated Indus sites, and I counted things, and I made percentage. The important takeaway here is the series of stacked columns that are outlined in the boxes. Those are the tools and ornaments, and they make up the majority of the assemblage, right? So the majority of Indus site copper and bronze stuff are tools used to make other things, or jewelry and bracelets and personal ornaments you wear to display. And again, don't get caught in the numbers. I try to make a promise that I would show as little numbers and graphs as I could get away with in this talk, and I've catastrophically failed, so I apologize. What I will try to do is highlight the takeaway message so you don't have to work through the numbers and graphs, right, from your seat while I ramble on. What we see is if we look at some of the earliest excavations, combined with some more modern stuff, is that copper alloys of any kind make up less than half the total assemblage, right? From about 467 analyzed objects over the last 80 years or so. And you guys are sitting there and be like, well, wait, that's less than half, and you just told me that they used a lot of alloys. So what are you saying? Well, what we see is that in early excavations the Archaeological Survey did at places like Mohenjo-Daro, they only reported just under 30%, so just under a third of the assemblage was bronze. But if we look at some more recent analyses conducted from the 1980s forward to as recently as 2014, a variety of excavators and investigators has reported anywhere between 50 and almost 80% of the analyzed assemblage being some sort of copper alloy. What this reflects is it reflects incomplete reporting of all the analyses done at Mohenjo-Daro. They only published several hundred of them. It's pretty clear they did more than that. The goals of Mohenjo-Daro were to identify tin bronzes, so they were only looking for one kind of alloy. And also, this was chemistry in the 1930s versus chemistry in 2015 or something. Right? Our ability to see and measure this stuff has gotten better. And as that's gotten better, it's been reflected that there was a lot more alloying going on in ancient Harappan cities and towns. What this enabled me to do was some investigations I did on excavated materials from Harappa as well. I was able to identify the following alloy types. The traditional tin alloy, but then you can see that I've identified 5 others. And I'm not wholly clever with this. These are alloys that have been talked about in other 3rd millennium Bronze Age using places by other researchers, but looking for this exact mix at an Indus copper and bronze assemblage was kind of a new perspective I was trying to apply. And what's important to know about all of these different combinations of alloys, and you see they're all some combination of arsenic, lead, and tin, either by themselves or in combination, is that each of these alloying elements can do a variety of things. But primarily they can do 2 things. They can impart some kind of strength advantage, like tin does. Bronze holds an edge better, it's more durable than just copper alone. Or they can change the color and hue and visual appearance of the final object, right? So you get a functional purpose or a visual purpose. So we can look at what the last, I guess it's over 30 years now, excavations at Harappa by the Harappa Archaeological Research Project, directed by Dr. Knoyer and Dr. Meadow. And you can see in blue here, this is pretty much all the places that Harp has opened up excavations across the site. And in almost all of them, we've gotten some amount of copper and bronze materials out of those excavations. So it's pretty pervasive across the site. It's a pretty prevalent raw material class. In the database I have, there's north of 2,400 individual objects at this point, and they can be roughly divided into these 15 categories. And again, don't get lost on the specific categories. I should point out coins. These coins are not Indus coins. Indus was not making coins. These are modern coins that get mixed into the record, but we do record them separately. But the blue is tools, things that you use to accomplish a task, right? Engravers, chisels, awls, adzes, things like that. The red are things that you would have worn or displayed, okay? And what analyzing the alloys, right? I did a variety of different kinds of analyses using lots of science machines. And you identify what I call two industries, and I put industries in quotes. In tools, all those things in blue come in a variety of alloys, because any number of things can be added to copper to make it hold its edge or be more durable, right? Not just tin. And you don't really care what it looks like as long as it does chisel things, right? If you're making a chisel, or if it's an engraving tool, right? As long as it holds its edge and allows you to accomplish your task. Where ornaments are very specific, or at least very much more specific. Bangles and discs were tin bronze. So the idea here being is that they were focused on the final visual appearance of the object. And that visual appearance was the importance of making a copper bead, or making a copper or bronze disc. And so Indus metal craft workers were very cognizant of that. And we see this pattern of tools made from alloys for function, ornaments made from alloys for visual appearance. There doesn't appear to be any restriction of access to these items across the site. Right? Individuals living in the different areas of the city of Harappa appear to all have a fairly equal chance of using and obtaining these items. They don't appear to be restricted just for elite use. And we also see the use of copper from multiple contemporary sources, and I'll try to get through that at the end of the talk. My second question was, where is this stuff getting made? And here I'm building off research that other people involved in the HART project have done, primarily Dr. Heather Miller, another PhD alum of the Department of Anthropology here at Madison. And her work and others have said that basically what's going on at cities like Harappa is they're doing what we would call melting. Okay? They're taking processed raw materials like an ingot, right? So it's already the copper ore, right? And it's been melted into metal, into an ingot, and they're melting it down over a fire, and they're casting it. Because we find objects like this reconstructed mold that's part of Dr. Knoyer's extensive experimental studies that don't leave a lot of traces in the record, right? Flat molds for making, here you see some knives, some axes, and some spears. In the smelting, the reduction of copper ore into a usable metal product was happening somewhere else, right? So Indus cities were not engaged in extensive copper and bronze production. That seems pretty reasonable, and we had excavation data that seemed to indicate that that was the case. However, in 2009, 2010, Dr. Knoyer came back from a visit to Harappa, and I was talking in the lab, and he showed me a sample from this larger 28-kilogram object. It eroded out of one of the large trenches at the site. And it looked for all the world to be the result of smelting copper ore down in the copper metal in some sort of large high-temperature furnace. And this process of refining copper ore into usable metal raw material was held to not happen in this site. So I was fortunate enough to be allowed the opportunity to take some samples of this, to run them through various analyses on the SAM down at the University Geology Department here. And this chart is all of the things one would expect to find if you were looking at a copper slag, right? You were looking at copper ore that got heated up and melted into molten metal, and the stuff you didn't want kind of flowed out, and that was the waste product left over. And all the stuff in green has been conclusively identified in the samples we've been analyzing this big chunk. So there's kind of no doubt about it. This is the result of putting copper ore into some kind of furnace, cranking it up to a high temperature, and attempting to extract metal. So if we kind of step back and we look at the data set from Harappa, and we look at slags, ores, little debris that indicate some kind of copper production was going on here, the kind of ceramics you would need to make crucibles and make furnaces, right? Those would leave remains behind. Mold fragments. We can see in the green and orangey color here that these appear in certain excavation areas of the site, usually at the margins or near a few workshop areas. So we look at the idea that there was a level of copper and bronze metallurgical production happening at Harappa, probably in multiple locations across the site, that previously was not theorized to be that extensive, right? It was theorized it was happening, but I believe there's data emerging that's happening at a larger scale. So turning to the final question I had where is this stuff coming from? And you see Harappa highlighted in red here, and various regional copper sources are highlighted by the green blobs on the map. So there's a technique called lead isotope analysis. You take a bit of copper or bronze, you dissolve it in some acid, and it gets taken into a variety of different kinds of mass spectrometers, and it measures the various isotopes of lead. This provides an isotopic fingerprint of that object. You can then match that isotopic fingerprint to the isotopic fingerprint of copper sources, right? So you can analyze ore on one hand and finished objects on the other, and try to correlate their isotopic fingerprints. When we do this with samples from Harappa, we get a list of, here's all the places on one side they don't show correlation with, and those aren't very critical to this topic. Those are just places that people have said, well, it could come here. But what I want you to focus on is Waziristan, Baluchistan, Rajasthan, and Oman, but primarily Rajasthan. Okay? That's where we start to see a correlation between artifacts from Harappa and copper ore sources. Narrowing this down a little bit and showing you similar information in a graphical way. Right? These are isotopically distinct copper sources. In other words, each different color on the map is roughly geographically where it comes from, and roughly a source region that I can demonstrate as a distinct isotopic fingerprint. And here I'm drawing on a lot of research done by Dr. Randy Law, and I need to acknowledge that much of this data comes from him. He's graciously shared it with me. But let's just focus on just Rajasthan, because that's the most interesting bit of this. There's all these places across Rajasthan, into Gujarat, and over into Haryana as well, where you have large copper deposits. It's been theorized by many people to be a source of Indus copper. And you can divide it up into zones, right? A north and south distinction is the most important here. That's all you need to take away. We look at a lot of samples from Harappa. We look at them across these 15 categories, and we have samples in all categories made from this northern Rajasthan and southern Rajasthan copper. We also see northern Rajasthan and southern Rajasthan copper sources appearing in all alloy categories, right? So it doesn't seem to be restricted in its use to any one thing at the study. This is the only one of these I show, I promise. We graph these isotopes in the way that they're traditionally done, and inside that little box, we see something that was unexpected in all of this. A certain isotopic ratio emerges that is distinctive to the Aravalli sources. And it looks like an Indus fingerprint. I cannot find in the literature or anywhere else another area that has copper with this isotopic fingerprint. So it's because of how old the rocks are in the region, is basically what it comes down to. So we turn back to this map, slightly relabeled to use the terms that we know from Mesopotamian text were used for some of the, so the area around Bahrain was an area called Dilmun, Oman was Magan, and the Indus was referred to as Maluha. And Mesopotamian texts at the time talk about copper coming from all of these places. So I said, well, let's look at copper there. I got a list of a variety of published artifacts of Mesopotamian bronzes, and 13 of them display this Indus signature. 11 of those are tin bronzes. What's more interesting is where these come from. These primarily come from elite contexts at places like Ur, places like the royal burials at Ur, and copper and bronze that were used to make wealth objects, fantastical objects that were buried with the elites. And if you comb the literature, and others have noticed this as well, there seems to be this idea that these bronzes that are coming from these elite contexts are primarily, in fact, overwhelmingly, being fashioned with copper raw material from the Indus, from these sources in the Aravalli range throughout Rajasthan. Now, I haven't been able to do any stylistic studies. As you can see, this is not the kind of stuff right now that we've been focused on, but you can see stylistically, right? Knives and swords and axes and adze in Mesopotamia have a very different style than those in the Indus between those two images, and as do other copper and bronze objects. So what needs to remain to be done are these Indus-style bronzes, in other words, are these finished tin bronzes that are showing up, or is this local work being done in a Mesopotamian style with bronze made from Indus copper. That part remains to be finished. There has been some supposition, and hopefully Dennis is going to help me out on this, that perhaps this is textually attested to. I know he's wrinkling his face up at me, and it's probably not good, but this is an idea that others have had, that there's this kind of way of referring to a certain kind of copper that people have said, maybe that's referring to copper from what we know now as the Indus. We look at the other areas I showed you on the map, right, Dilmun and Magan, and there's an extensive copper industry in both of these places. And this copper industry is also trading with Mesopotamia. But what we see is we don't see Indus style or Indus signature artifacts or raw materials showing up there. They seem to be filling their needs through local supply. The same thing happens in Oman, right? In the UAE, we have a small data set from published work by Weeks that says, here's some things we took the isotopic fingerprint of, and they don't match up with the local Oman ores we were expecting them to. But we think it's just an Oman ore that we haven't sampled extensively yet. It's possible that some of these objects from these tombs match up with sources within South Asia, particularly this Indus signature and possibly another source more towards the Baluchistan area. So possibly, again, we're seeing hints of this pattern, that in an elite tomb context, that copper and bronze from the Indus was functioning as a status or prestige item. Returning to this map, we see that obviously we have the Indus signature present in the Indus, and we have it present in Mesopotamia, which is not surprising, because we have documentation of raw materials and finished craft goods from South Asia in an Indus style showing up in Mesopotamian sites in all kinds of different contexts and different ways. So I believe we can add copper and bronze into this already existing structure that the work of previous researchers has demonstrated. But what we don't have is we don't have evidence yet for an Indus signature in all of the spots in between. Okay, so maybe they're just going straight to Mesopotamia on this particular trade route. But what's interesting is looking at just Oman or Magan on some of these other slides. We have evidence for extensive interaction with the Indus at sites in Oman, things, and indicating connections to the Indus. And we see a bit, even at Harappa, which is far away from Oman, we see a bit of possibly Omani source copper showing up in the Harappa record. So it becomes interesting why we're not seeing Indus copper and bronze there. So what we see is that Mesopotamia, the Indus is using copper alloys for both utilitarian and status goods, right? Goods that have a function and these visual purpose items that are used to fulfill something. They're getting their major supply from South Asia, and that stands in contrast to the other ones, the other sites in the area that are using lots of copper and bronze that are in Oman and Bahrain. They're fulfilling their needs with local raw materials, and they are also participating in shipping some of this out to Mesopotamia, just like the Indus is. But what seems to be different is Indus copper seems to be the preferred raw material for making bronzes. So to bring us all back to Harappa, I know I'm getting close on time and I apologize. What we see, what I think we see, is that alloying practices at Harappa for these classes of decorative objects, personal ornaments, were driven by the desired visual appearance of the final object. If you add this much lead to it, it takes on this color. If you add some tin to it, it shines up this way, right? And you can make different mixes of these alloys in a careful, controlled way, and you can provide copper and bronze beads or bangles or rings, right, that have an array of visual appearances. And we see this in other well-studied personal ornament raw materials, is that this creates a hierarchy of raw materials, a different set of appearances, and one may be valued over another, and one may signal something that another doesn't. So this was probably the desired thing, is they wanted to use these to display information about social position through the ornaments they were wearing. Pretty stark contrast to that, utilitarian things, right? Engravers, chisels, what have you. They are used to accomplish a task. the alloy selected for their use was purely functional reasons. Appearance didn't matter, and the performance of the final product was the only thing that mattered. So to kind of highlight this, because I wanted to show you some pictures, I don't always have great pictures of this, but we have this object. Looks to be a laminated disc that probably would have been worn as some sort of decorative element. On one side, the side I think you wouldn't see, right? It's unalloyed copper. And the part of it you would see is a very specific tin lead alloy that would have had a distinctive color. So I believe in this kind of composite, I call it a laminated object. We're seeing the skill and premeditation of Harappan copper and bronze metal workers to achieve a desired finished product through a variety of different ways. And so we can look at copper and bronze metallurgy at Harappa, and we can see that raw materials are coming from South Asia and Oman, but they seem to be very focused on sources across the Aravalli Range in Rajasthan, and then also sources throughout Baluchistan. There seems to be no pattern of alloying by artifact type or location within the site. This alloying pattern is related to the use of the final product, like I was talking about previously. Multiple locations at the site are engaging in copper and bronze production. And then we have the evidence for all aspects of that production, from the processing of the raw ore to the finishing of the final product, also possibly the remelting and recycling of old products to make new ones. It was used to display wealth and status, but it was also used to make utilitarian everyday items. And the control of this does not seem to be focused on elite control. It appears to be decentralized and relatively unrestricted. So I'll throw one final thing in here, and what's really interesting is that at Dolavira, we have some raw materials and ingots, so processed raw materials that have this distinctive Indus signature. And they're coming from the closest major copper source to this site, I believe. And it's interesting because Dolavira has been hypothesized as kind of a trading community that may have had some outward focus, may have been an entryway into the Indus for some of these communities across the water. So perhaps we're seeing Dolavira participating in external trade networks for copper and bronze to places like Mesopotamia. Thank you.